Alhamdulillah, salatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi ajma'in. Allahumma faqihna fi din wa allimna at-ta'wil ya Rabbal alameen. قال صلى الله عليه وسلم من يرد الله به خيرا يفقهه في الدين. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make this majlis, this gathering, a gathering of knowledge and a gathering that is blessed, inshaAllah ta'ala. Continuing from last week we stopped off at where we were discussing the price and the commodity. So we were discussing from the pillars of the contract and the second pillar, which is the price and the commodity. And there are three conditions that the price and the commodity that need to be fulfilled. So when we speak about the price and the commodity, we mean the two items that are being exchanged at the time of the contract. So the money that's being exchanged, so what it's being bought for, and that thing that is that the person is buying. So for example, if a person is purchasing an iPhone for $1,000, the price or the thaman, as the fuqaha mention, or as they say, the thaman would be $1,000, and the commodity or the muthman, the thing that is being bought, would be the iPhone. So we mentioned last week that from the conditions is that it must be qadirun hala taslimihi. You must be able to hand over that item. We also mentioned that it must be a known, both must be known. The price, the price must be known, and that thing that you are buying with the price, that commodity, that item, that product that you're buying must be known as well. And we went into details on how it is known, such as by seeing it or description, etc. Now, which brings us to the last condition of the price and the commodity, which is that they must be considered mal. So they must be considered mal. The two items being exchanged must be considered mal in Islam in order for it to be a legal transaction. And a lot of people they have a misconception when it comes to the word mal and what it means. And most of us, when we hear the word mal, the first thing that comes to mind is money, right? And this is not the case. Mal in Islam is it's much more general or wider than just money. In Islam, mal is anything that has a value in the Sharia. So mal is defined as anything that has a value, anything that has some sort of value in the Sharia. And the fuqaha, they have a specific definition when it comes to fiqh al-mu'amalat al-maliyah, when it comes to fiqh of business transactions, and they say mal is anything فيه منفعة مباح لغير حاجة. So mal, their definition of it, is a item or a commodity that has a permissible or a halal benefit or usage other than the times of necessity or other than the times of need. And we'll explain this definition further. So the first condition that the fuqaha mention is number one, is that it must have a benefit. So this thing that you are selling and that you're buying, the two things that are being exchanged must have a benefit. So this leaves off, or it takes out, or it omits anything that does not have a benefit. So anything that does not have a benefit is not halal or not permissible to sell in Islam or in the Sharia. And the scholars they give an example like cockroaches or insects, or for example, if a person just gathers together some stones or some rocks or something which does not really have a benefit, or gathers together some sand, right? Of course, in these situations where there is a benefit, sand, people may buy sand for, construction or for other reasons. People may need the cockroaches for something, for example, in a lab test, or scientists, they may need insects for some sort of benefit. If there is a benefit and a real usage, that is coming out from anything, any of these items or any other items. This is just an example, but if there is a benefit, a real benefit, then it is permissible to sell that item or to buy that item. The second condition which the scholars mention is that that benefit must be halal. So it must have a benefit, and that benefit must be halal. So, for example, if we look at the case of musical instruments or alcohol or khamr, beer or wine. If we look at musical instruments, is there a benefit to that? Of course, there is a benefit. There is a benefit. The sounds come out, music is being played from the instruments, right? However, that benefit is a haram benefit. We look at alcohol as well. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has even told us that fihi manfa', right? There is a manfa', there is benefit in alcohol. However, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala also told us that the harms are much greater than the benefit. So we know that the alcohol or khamr, the drink that people use to drink to get drunk, is something which is haram, right? And we're not allowed to use it. We're not allowed to consume it or drink it, right? I'm not talking about medical alcohol or pharmaceutical alcohol or the alcohol that is used for wiping down or disinfecting. That is a total different scenario. I'm talking about the alcohol here that is used to get drunk, right? So this alcohol is prohibited. It is haram for a person to use, and therefore it is haram to sell it also and to buy it, right? Finally, or before we go to the last condition, or the last condition of mal, some other examples of items which are haram are things that are impure, like things that are najis, things that are considered najis in Islam. These are things that we are not allowed to sell. They are not halal to consume or to use. Also idols, books of sihr or books of magic. These are all haram things that we are not allowed to buy or sell. The last condition of mal is that it must be halal, but that it must be absolutely halal, and not only halal in a certain exception. So, for example, we look at the case of dead meat. Now, dead meat, a person can say that he can argue that dead meat is halal if you have nothing else to eat, right? And that is true. Dead meat is halal if you have nothing else to consume or to eat, and you're at the situation where you are starving and you may die, right? Then of course you're allowed to eat whatever you can to survive, to protect your life. However, in a normal situation, dead meat would be haram. So when we're judging if something is mal or not, we don't look at the exceptions. We look at what do we consider this item in a normal circumstance or a normal situation. So in a normal situation, dead meat would be considered haram. In a normal situation, khamr or beer, wine would be haram. In a normal situation, pork or swine or anything that comes from, pig meat would be haram. And of course, if you're in a dying situation, these things would be halal. However, when we're talking about mal and the definition of mal in the Sharia, we are talking about a normal situation. So we judge the item by what it would be considered in a normal situation. Next, okay, before we go on to the next slide, so typically anything that falls under transgression, ambiguity or uncertainty, gambling, and interest or riba must be avoided. So these things are usually the asbab or the reasons for something to be prohibited in terms of buying and selling and in terms of transactions in Islam. So if there's some sort of transgression, if there's some sort of and transgression goes in, it plays in part with interest as well, right? When you charge interest, you're transgressing against your brother or your sister in Islam. So if there's some sort of transgression, uh, if there's some sort of uncertainty when you're going into, you don't know exactly what you're buying, um, if there is any sort of gambling, right? And gambling in Islam, maisr, is considered haram, and the definition of maisr in Islam is going into a contract where you pay a certain amount of money, and either there are two options. You either lose all your money, or you win a big, large amount of money, or a large, the thing that you gain, the value is very large. So, for example, when you go to a carnival and you play a game, you may pay the entrance fee, which is might be $1 or $2, and you play, and then either you lose your money, right, or either you may win a very, very big prize, right? You may so in this case, that would be considered gambling, right? When you play, you pay a certain amount of money, or you have to pay something, and the outcome would be either you lose that or you win a very large amount of money, or a very large amount of something that is worth a lot of money. And interest, we will inshallah come in the next chapters and speak about the details of riba and the different types of riba, and how riba occurs in different circumstances and in different specific products or items that riba can actually occur in, inshallah ta'ala. So we spoke a little bit about exceptions, and in the cases of necessity, and we mentioned a little bit that we mentioned that the rules don't apply. So what is an exception, and what are considered exceptions in Islam? So I just wanted to cover this very briefly since we mentioned it. So exceptions in Islam are divided into two categories. Number one are needs, or a haja, and a haja is something where a person it's very difficult for a person to live without. And so the scholars, they mentioned there are three conditions, or three sifat, or descriptions of a hajj. And number one is that it's extremely difficult to live without. Number two is that it is not a life-threatening condition. And number three is that there is a substitute available. So the scholars, they give the example of using a dog. So we know that the asl for using a dog, or for having a dog with you, it is haram. So it is haram to to buy and sell a dog. It's haram to have a dog with you. And we know that the Prophet ﷺ, he mentioned that having a dog, it decreases your ajr, every single day, right? So your ajr, your rewards are decreased every single day by one qirat, which is a very big amount of reward. And he said that the dog decreases your ajr one qirat, except in three cases. And those three cases would be: number one is a guard dog, so a security. So using a guard dog or a dog as security. Number two is using a dog for herding, or number three, using a dog for hunting. So these are the three cases where a dog is allowed. So the scholars say that in the case of security, security, using a dog as a guard dog, it's something which is needed, right? But however, it is not, it's not life threatening, and there is a substitute available. You don't necessarily need a dog, right? But the Sharia has allowed for us to use a dog for herding, or for security purposes, or for hunting. So, in summary, a need is something which is very hard to live without. It's not life-threatening, and there is a substitute available. And we're only allowed to go to that substitute, or that halal substitute, if you find a dalil. So you have to have a dalil, or evidence, for for something which is considered a need. For example, using a dog. Also, another example the scholars mention is, in Islam, we're not allowed to use utensils that are made out of gold and silver. However, you are allowed to patch your cup with silver. And this was something that was used, back in the time of the Prophet ﷺ and the Sahaba. It was common that they would patch their cups with silver. Now we find that there is a need. If you have a cup and you can't use it, then it's going to be difficult for you. You don't have one of your cups are not being used, right? So it would be difficult, to live without that, without patching it, right? Without patching it. It's not life-threatening, obviously. You can live without the cup, and there is a substitute available. You can patch it with something else. However, you can patch it with metal or with something else. However, we have a dalil that allows us to go over, to use the silver material to patch the cup. And normally, in normal circumstances, we're not allowed to use silver to eat or drink from. But in this case, since we have the dalil, we are allowed to use it. The second type is when there is a necessity. So the second type of exception in Islam is when there is a necessity. And a necessity is something that is life-threatening and there is no substitute. So for example, you are in the middle of a desert and your life, is at stake here because you have no food, right? And the only thing you can do is you can, eat this dead animal, or you can eat this pig that you see, something that is normally haram, right? So what do? You go and you eat that, that animal in order to preserve your life, right? So in this case, if it is a dire necessity and your life is on the board, then you're allowed to go ahead with it, inshallah. And there's no substitute. So if there is a halal substitute, if there is something that you can, some other sort of substitute that you can do or you can use, then you have to go to that substitute, right? If there's no substitute, to preserve your life, for example, then you go to the haram. And in this case, it is not haram for you, it is halal. So it is permissible if there is no substitute available. So we had a question here. I had a question on the previous slide. So someone mentioned that cockroaches could be halal if it's beneficial for a certain type of community. So the example I gave was cockroaches. If it is beneficial to, for example, scientists, they're studying it or they're doing some sort of, it is beneficial in some sort of way, then it is allowed to be sold, right? It is allowed to be sold. I was just trying to find an example where an item would not be beneficial. And it's very hard to find an item. This is something that the scholars use. They use cockroaches or they use the example of insects, but even insects, some of them have benefits as well. The main point is that if there is no benefit in the item, then it is not considered mal in Islam. We had a question. I saw a hand up from Brother Ahmed. If he wants to ask the question that was related, or we'll continue and you can ask at the end, inshallah. Okay, so the offer and acceptance. So as we mentioned before, the offer and acceptance is the way how the transaction is made, right? So the first condition is that it has to be present. So there must be some sort of transaction that takes place in the present tense. So there must be either some money being given to the buyer, to the seller, or the seller giving his the commodity to the buyer, right? There must be some sort of present transaction. A transaction cannot take place in the future, and it cannot take place in the future while you are signing or while you are transacting that transaction now, but you want to execute it in the future. The ways to conduct the transaction. So we mentioned that, we mentioned this earlier as well, that it can be transacted verbally. So a person says, I buy this item from you, and the seller says, okay, I sell this item to you at this price. It can be a written transaction, and it can be a transaction that takes place by action or by gesture. So verbally, so verbally, the transaction, for example, a transaction in Islam can take place verbally, and there's no problem with the verbal transaction, inshallah ta'ala. Also written, we know that there are, a transaction can be written, there can be contracts written, and that is a better form of conducting a transaction when there is a written transaction and there are witnesses that are there as well. Also, when you do a transaction that's verbal, you may want to have some witnesses, especially if it's a big transaction, so that you would protect yourself. And by gesture, um, when a person, for example, just goes to the counter, he puts down, the items that he wants to pay for, he pays without writing anything or without verbally saying anything. He puts the item on the scanner and he pays whatever comes up on the register, and he goes out without saying a word. This would be by action or by gesture. Now, also, which is included in the sigha or in the offer and acceptance, is the type of transaction that is taking place. So you want to make sure when you're transacting an item, if it is not, if it is not, if it is not blatantly apparent what type of transaction you're doing, you want to make sure that you're mentioning that type of transaction. So, for example, when you go to the store, the grocery store, and you put your item down, everyone knows what you're doing. You're buying an item, and the store is selling that item to you. However, when you invite your friend over to your house and you pay him a certain amount of money, you pay him $1,000. You need to know why he needs to know why you're paying him that, and you need to know why you're paying him that money, because there may be nothing apparent to prove that, or to prove why you're paying that money. So, for example, you may be paying him for rent. So you tell him, look, this is the money for rent. Or, for example, you're paying him for a car. So you tell him, look, this is the money for the car, right? And of course, it would be better if you had something written, or you had a physical written contract when you're doing such transactions that are not, blatantly apparent. Now we come to the section or the topic of things that are circumstances where buying and selling may be prohibited or lead to haram. So, number one is when a circumstance when buying and selling is haram, or it leads to something that is haram, is after the second adhan of al-Jum'ah. So the scholars mentioned that ممن تلزمه الجمعة بعد نداء الثاني إلا لحاجة. So the scholars, they mention that after the second adhan, when it is time for the Jum'ah Salah, it is haram to buy or to sell or to transact any type of item. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, يا أيها الذين آمنوا إذا نودي للصلاة من يوم الجمعة فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع ذلكم خير لكم إن كنتم تعلمون. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O you who believe, when the adhan is called for the prayer on the day of Jum'ah, then proceed to the remembrance of Allah. فاسعوا إلى ذكر الله وذروا البيع, and leave off trading. This is better for you only if you knew it. So we have a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling us that when the adhan is called for Jum'ah, we need to leave off buying and selling. So who needs to leave off buying and selling? Who is this command to? When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, when he's commanding the believers, who is he really commanding? So the scholars, they mentioned that the person that is commanded to leave off buying and selling here is the person who must pray the Jum'ah Salah. And those that must pray the Jum'ah Salah are men that are free, that are muqim, that are that are a resident and that are over the age of puberty. So a man, if it's a man, if you're a man, if you're a free man, of course, and if you're not a traveler, you're a resident and you're over the age of puberty, then it is wajib for you to pray Salat al-Jum'ah, and therefore it is wajib for you to leave off buying and selling. So a woman is allowed to buy and sell. Slaves are allowed, or slaves do not have to pray Jum'ah. Travelers are allowed to buy and sell in the time of Jum'ah because they do not have to pray Salat al-Jum'ah. And children under the age of puberty, as we mentioned, they are allowed to buy and sell if it is a item that is small. So the scholars here also, they mention that if there is a need, then a person is allowed to buy and sell, even if he is, he is from those that have to pray the Salatul Jum'ah. So for example, a person does not have a garment to cover his awrah for prayer. For example, he's running to Jum'ah, and he rips his pants, or he rips his thawb, for example, and his awrah is showing. He needs to buy new clothing. So he's allowed to go purchase clothing and then join the Jum'ah. A person comes to Jum'ah and he goes to the washroom. He realizes that the water is not working and he needs to make wudu. What does he do? He goes out and he purchases water and he makes his wudu and he comes and he prays. So in certain exceptions where there is a need, then he's allowed to conduct the transaction in those times. Number 2 is selling for haram usage. So selling something which will result in a definite haram or prohibition. And the scholars, they give the example of selling grapes to those that will make it into wine or beer or alcohol. Another example would be selling weapons during the time of fitna. So during the time of war, when people are, fighting and killing innocent people, then trading weapons is something that is haram in Islam. And this is one of the reasons why, companies that are making, warcraft planes and making weapons are haram to invest in the stock market. So when you look at the stock market, there are certain companies which supply the army, the military, right, which supply different government militaries, and those companies are haram to invest in. And this is the reason, because they will be used to kill people and most likely kill Muslims. And even if not killing Muslims, they will be used to kill innocent lives. Now, speaking about this, we are not commanded, when a person comes to buy something from you, we're not commanded to go into great detail and to investigate why they're buying this item from us. The Prophet ﷺ said, "Min husn Islam al-mar' tarkuhu ma la ya'ni." Prophet ﷺ said, from the perfection of one's deen, of one's religion, is leave that which does not concern him. So a person comes and he wants to buy something from you, you don't have to ask him, why are you buying this item from me? However, if it is blatantly apparent that what he is doing is something haram or will result in something haram, then you should leave it off, and you're not allowed to sell to him. So for example, a person comes, you have a grape farm, and a person comes and he wants to buy grapes. He drives up in your driveway and you can see that this person is coming from a beer company, some brewing company. And the logo is on his shirt. He's a representative of the company. It says it on his truck, and he says, "Look, I want to buy all your grapes." Then in this case, you are not allowed to sell it to him, right? Because it's something that's apparent that he's going to be using that, or your grapes will be used in a haram way. Number 3 is selling over another Muslim, or selling over your brother. So the Prophet ﷺ said, "لا يبيع رجل على بيع أخيه ولا يخطب عن خطبة أخيه إلا أن يأذن له." The Prophet ﷺ said, a person should not enter into a transaction where his brother is already making a transaction, or not make a proposal, a marriage proposal, where his brother is making a marriage proposal, except where he gives permission. This hadith is in Sahih Muslim. So if you know that your brother has already made a transaction, then you're not allowed to go in, try to, overbid him in that certain circumstance. Or you're not allowed to try and grab a sale from a person when the sale has already been conducted. So for example, and we'll give an example of this, Zaid, he buys a car for $10,000. And the seller gives him 3 days. So he says, look, Zaid, you have 3 days, check this car out. If you don't like it, give it back to me. If you like it after the 3 days, then the sale is final and we go our two ways, we part ways. But I'm guaranteeing you that you'll like this car. So Zaid has 3 days with this car. 3 days of khiyar, of choosing to return this car or to keep this car. Now, his friend Ammar comes and Zaid shows him the car, and Ammar says, how much did you pay for this car? So Zaid tells him, I paid $10,000. So Ammar says, I can get you a better car for a lower price. I can get you a better car, ahsan min hada. I can get you a better car than this for the same price or for lower. I'll sell you a better car for lower. So what is he doing there? He's basically undercutting, the sale of his brother. So Zaid says, okay, I have 3 days. Let me return this car and buy the car from you. And the result is that, Zaid returns the car and he goes for the better deal, right? So in this case, this is, this is considered selling over the sale of your brother. So Ammar is selling over the sale of his Muslim brother, and this is something that is prohibited in Islam. Similarly, buying over the sale of your Muslim brother is also prohibited. So for an example of this would be the opposite. So we have Jamal, and he has a stand in the market. He's selling watches. He has a very, very nice watch, a blue watch, and he's selling it for $100. So Ahmed comes and he sees this watch. He picks it up and he pays him $100 to purchase this watch. Khalid is looking at this watch. So this is another person, Khalid, he's looking at this watch from far, and he comes and he wants the watch, but Ahmed already took the watch. So Ahmed is there and he purchased the watch and he has it in his hands. Khalid says, look, I really like that watch. And he tells Jamal, which is the seller of the watch, he says, look, I'll give you $150 if you give me that watch. And of course, we are still in the majlis al-aqd, so we're still in the place of the transaction. So Jamal is allowed, technically he is allowed to invalidate the sale that he just made and sell it to Khalid. So he's still in the time of khiyar. And the Prophet ﷺ said, البايعان بالخيار ما لم يتفرقا. The two buyers and sellers are in the mode of khiyar. They're allowed to go back on their transaction as long as they have not departed from the place of transaction. So here we have Jamal, he's selling the watch, and Ahmed, he's still there, and Ahmed paid the money and he has the watch, but he hasn't left the stall yet. So what does Jamal do? Jamal says, look, I want to go back on my sale. I'll give you your money back. Give me the watch back. So he gives his money back to Ahmed. He takes the watch back and he sells it to Khalid for $150. And this is the example that the scholars use for selling over the sale of your brother, or buying over the sale of your brother. And the reason for this prohibition is that it causes disliking amongst the brothers, and it could lead into ill feelings and cause animosity and enemies amongst the Muslim ummah and the community. The final way, or the fourth type of transaction which is prohibited is selling or buying and selling in the masjid. The Prophet ﷺ, he said in a hadith, when you see someone selling or buying in the masjid, then say, may Allah not profit your business. And when you see someone announcing something they lost in the masjid, then say, may Allah not return it to you. And this hadith is in At-Tirmidhi and it is authentic. So trading in the masjid is something which is haram. And when we say in the masjid, we mean in the area of the musalla. So the masjid is considered in the area of the musalla. So wherever the musalla is, that is considered the area of the masjid. So when you come outside of the courtyard of the masjid, that is not considered the masjid. So a lot of masajid, most masajid, they have the area where they conduct the salah, and then they have the exterior area, which is still in the building, but it's not a place of prayer, and you are allowed to buy and sell in that area. Or for example, they have another room. They may have a store in the building of the masjid, or they may have a library, or they may have other rooms, right? Buying and selling is allowed there, is not allowed, however, in the actual musalla of the masjid. Okay, so we'll stop here inshallah, and I'll take questions. It is now 9:30. Okay, so I'll be taking questions inshallah. If you want to raise your hand and you want to speak, you can do that, or I will be taking those that are in the chat. I already have about 2 questions right now that are mentioned here. So number 1 is, so certain items like grapes should be only sold after knowing what the purpose is being used for. So not necessarily you have to know the usage. So grapes, it depends. If you're selling grapes and you're selling a small amount, then you know that the person is going to, usually they'll be eating the grapes, right? When you go to a grocery store, right? What do they usually do with the grapes? They buy it for eating, right? There are certain types of grapes which are made for wine, right? And it could be made for other purposes too. Like you can make juice out of grapes as well, right? You can use the grapes for cooking or for different things. Not necessarily wine all the time, but if you have those type of dates which are normally used for wine, and someone is coming for a large amount, perhaps that should that should stir some red flags, and you should maybe just further investigate a little bit. But the asl is that you do not have to go into details unless it is apparent. Okay, so I was wondering if zakah is applicable on GST amount a business collects, or is the cash balance from sales minus GST plus other assets. GST is held for government here in Ontario and then paid back semi-annually, for example, so is not a part of revenue assets. So the question is zakah. So in terms of zakah on business, you would pay zakah if you have that money, whether it's GST or whether it's something else. If you own it for 1 year, so you have to have hawl, and it has to be if your money or your business, the revenue coming in from your business is over the nisab, right? Now, if you owe the money, then that would you don't pay zakah on that because you owe that money to the government. So if you'll be paying it, then you most likely will not be holding on to that for 1 year anyway, right? So the answer would be no. You don't have to pay zakah if in this case you'll be paying it to the government. And so the easiest way to calculate zakah for a business is just look at your profit, your yearly profit, and calculate it based on your yearly profit at the end of the at the bottom line, right? At the bottom line, calculate that after you minus all of your expenses and you minus everything. Okay, I want to clarify for the exception, and there is a need. All those 3 conditions need to be met. Not only one of them. If there's a substitute, isn't it better to use a substitute? So yes, all of those 3 conditions need to be met. So if there is a substitute, and you have a dalil from the Quran or the Sunnah, then you're allowed to use the the whatever is mentioned. So for example, guarding your house, right? You can guard your house without, you can hire a man to guard your house, right? You can have a security system to guard your house, right? But we do have the dalil and the evidence that the Prophet ﷺ rakhasa, he gave the exception for us to use a dog. So you're allowed to use a dog, a guard dog, to guard your house, right? You don't necessarily have to avoid it. If it is mentioned, then you're allowed to do that if it makes your life easier. Can you sell grapes pre-season when the grapes are not ready, or any other fruits? Okay. Um, we will come to the chapter of selling and buying, selling fruits. And one of the conditions is when you're selling grapes or you're selling fruits, if you're selling it before they ripe, number one is they have to have some sort of benefit. So you can't be, so that the fruit would not be wasted. And number two is that you have to cut them off of the tree and sell them right away as is. So a person cannot come and say, I want to buy your grapes. I see them on the tree. They're very, very green right now, but I want to secure myself and buy those grapes or buy those fruits. He cannot do that. If he's buying the grapes, you have to cut them off and you have to give it to him right away. And it goes for any other type of fruit as well. So regarding prohibition of business transactions after the second adhan of Jum'ah, what will happen when there are 3 Jum'ahs? Will you apply this rule to the Jum'ah you are planning to offer? Wallahu a'lam. Allahu a'lam. The best answer for this would be you would apply it to your Jum'ah. You know, the origin is that only one Jum'ah should be performed in a masjid. But you know, since you know we have special circumstances in our cities because of the influx of Muslims and the shortage of masajid, then we are you know, doing more than one Jum'ah. So it would, wallahu alam, it would apply to whatever Jum'ah that you are going to, inshallah ta'ala. Anything which goes to make profits should be zakatable except haram items. So I don't understand the question here. Are you asking, so haram items you don't pay zakat, of course you have to do tathir of that. You have to give that up. So what the scholars say is, if it's a haram item, for example, you've invested into a stock that is haram, the scholars consider haram, then you have to do tathir, and tathir is purifying that, which is giving up your profits without the intention of any ajr, or without the intention of any reward. If the only way to acquire something is for a future trade, can we enter into it? For example, I need electric parts and there is a shortage, and the supplier says he can give me 30 days, but I have to pay now. That contract is valid. If he fails to deliver, he will refund me. If I don't, I risk not getting it. Okay, so this is not a future trade, right? So a future trade in Islam means that there is no trade at the time of the transaction. So if he for example says, look, I will, you make a transaction, you make a contract that you will pay him after 2 months and he will deliver the goods to you after 5 months, for example, right? That is considered a future trade. If you are giving him the money right now, then that's totally fine. That is halal. That would be considered, that would fall under a normal circumstance, and that is perfectly fine. If you pay him up front and then he delivers the goods to you within 30 days, that's perfectly fine, inshallah ta'ala. Can people have dogs for enjoyment as pets as long as they keep it outside in the home, places where they have big yards in front of the house? No. So dogs cannot be kept for enjoyment or a pet. The dogs can only be kept if there is a reason, and if that reason falls into one of the 3 categories that the Prophet ﷺ mentioned: for herding animals, or for herding sheep, for guarding your house, or for hunting. How does 30% interest bearing work in the terms of Sharia compliant stocks if balance sheet shows that the total assets are greater than the liabilities? However, Zoya, for example, shows it as non-Sharia compliant. How do we proceed? So A stock can be non-Sharia compliant for other reasons, not only the interest-bearing aspect of it, right? As I mentioned, for example, they could be doing activities that are haram. They could be supplying the military. They could be, doing other activities that are haram. This part of 30% debt to asset ratio is just one of the conditions, right? And inshallah, we'll go into more detail when we talk about stocks and stuff. Um, but that's just a summary that 30%. So there's some of the scholars who allow. So first of all, not all of the scholars allow a person to enter into or to invest into stocks which have some sort of haram transactions that they are doing. So when we talk about stocks, there are three types of stocks or three types of companies that you can invest in. Number one is that everything they do is halal, right? Their transactions are halal and the products that they sell are halal, right? Number two is that the second category of stock of companies which you can invest, which are available to invest in, are companies where what their products and services are halal, but the way they transact their money, they may fall into some haram. So for example, they may give credit to their customers and they may charge them interest, right? Their product is halal, but the way they're transacting is haram. And the third category is a company that is selling something which is haram. So for example, they are selling alcohol, right? So this, the consensus of the ulama say that you're not allowed to invest in those companies. However, the second type of company where their products and services are halal, but their transactions are, they may have some sort of haram type of transactions. A lot of the scholars say, the majority of them say that it is even haram to invest in them and to purchase those shares. However, some of the scholars have mentioned that if 5% or less of their profits come from those haram transactions, then it is allowed to invest in them. And they also make the condition that 30% or less of their debt to asset ratio must be 30% or less. So who they are indebted to versus the amount of assets they have should be 30% or less. Referring to GST, my question. Okay. I was referring to GST, to the GST question, if it adds to your profit. If it adds to the profit qualifying, so yeah, we can run out. Okay. Okay, if there are no more questions, then we'll end the call, inshallah ta'ala, and we'll continue next week. بإذن الله.